I'm going to make this the intro to part 21, and I'm not going to keep doing these introductions. I just needed you to be aware of something that's going to happen in the video. As you can see in the background, the TA is into the casing. I've got the lower shaft in. Don't have it tightened up yet, but it's in with the gears and stuff. But the thing that I want you to see is me putting the TA back in. Sometimes you read something or listen to somebody and you take a different meaning from it than what is actually written or what is actually said. And that kind of happened to me with this TA going back into this housing. Now, I came up with a way of putting this TA back in. To begin with, I put the TA back in two sections and could not get the splines to line up with the cogs and the clutch plates to doing that. So I had to take it back out again and put the two pieces together, the upper half and lower half of the TA, and put it back in as one unit. So you're going to see me coming up with a way of putting those two halves together, holding those two halves together to be able to put into the TA. And then me going back to the manual to show you how I did it versus what they said, only to find out what they said is what I did. And I had interpreted it as something else from the manual originally. So maybe get a laugh at my expense out of this whole thing, but here goes the video. Hopefully you're going to be able to see this. I'm going to start putting the TA back in. Now, since I don't know, I got 4 of those gaskets and they're varying thicknesses, so I'm not really sure which one goes where, but I'm just gonna try one gasket, one of the thicker gaskets right now, and then I'll come back if I need to change the shimming of it by using thicker or thinner gaskets. I'll bring it back. What I've got to do is get the bolts up from the bottom on that, so let me bring you back for it. Kind of the funny thing that's happening is I've got to figure out what bolts went where. So I had 4 bolts with a lock washer, and I'm kind of thinking that held that lower part of the TA in. So I had to actually go back to one of the videos and see, and these 4 bolts with the lock washers hold the back plate on, the bearing retaining plate on. So it's and I tried putting them into the lower part of the TA, and they were way too short. So these 4 bolts are going to be used. I've got there's 5 longer bolts someplace, and they're going to go in the outside. So I've kind of had to narrow it down to what was what here. So I've got them 5 longer bolts, and there's a 5 bolts that hold the TA into the housing. These 5 bolts right here. So kind of got to narrow it down and figure out what went where. So I'll bring it back. Okay, so the lower part of the TA is bolted in now. Now I'm going to set the upper half of the TA in. I've got to clean that flange off a little bit, and I'll set that upper half of the TA in. Got to get the O-ring onto it, but let me do that. I'll show it to you as I'm doing it. I've got to get it hooked up to the engine hoist and drop it in. Okay, so I'm getting ready to set this thing down into it. What I did is when I put the O-ring on the TA, I lubed it up with some high-tran oil. Let me get, I gotta get it down in there a little bit. Let me grab a hammer. I imagine it will go, but here's what I'm dealing with. It looks like it's on, but I have that gap in there. Just some finagling, but I'll bring you back. What happened is I pulled the TA back out again. I could not get the upper part of the TA to go into the lower part of the TA. And the reason why is there's these, where are they? If I could show you on the other one. Oh, these like pawls here that have to line up with the gear shaft in there. And what it was is I pulled both parts apart and I kind of tried to spin them together, and it took a while actually with it out and loose to get them all lined up. So between the tight fit going into the housing and trying to line them things up, it's a very difficult situation. So what I did was I'm going back to the thing of when they talked about taking it apart, they talked about putting a 1/4-inch bolt and bolts in to do it, and I couldn't figure out what the hell they were talking about. There is no 1/4-inch bolt tap around that you can go through. What I did find was one of the part of the end shaft in there is tapped for a 5/16. Now it's going to be off center, but it will work. So what I'll have to do is just make a little plate, I've got to get a longer 5/16 bolt. 5/16 bolts aren't the things that I really have on hand. Get a longer 5/16 bolt and make like some washers or do something. It'll be off center, but as long as it holds it together so I can sit the whole thing down there in a unit, it'll work. So when I do that, I'll bring you back. Okay, so here's what I did is I went out and got a 5/16 bolt. Now after I got that longer bolt, I kind of suspect them threads in there are actually 1/4 inch pipe threads. But you can get a 5/16 bolt to start in a couple of threads before it starts binding up. So what I did is just took some washers. It doesn't really have to hold that much weight, just kind of got to keep it together until you get it in place, and then you can pull it out. But I just took a couple of washers and shimmed it out so that I didn't want to screw them threads up, even though you could, if you had to work on it again, just take a 1/4 inch pipe tap probably and get it to work. But I'll bring you back. Let me show you what I did. I'm lowering it in there. It's still not quite all the way down in, but what I did was came down here. Now I'm not going to see if you're going to be able to see it. You'll probably see that. I found a couple 3/8 longer bolts and just put them in there, a couple of threads, so that it lines the lower part of the casing up with a bolt pattern that it attaches to. So now I can lower it down the rest of the way and then synchronize the bolt pattern on top as I do it. Okay, so there's a TA. I just snugged those bolts up. I've still got to go down there and put the bolts in. I've still got those those longer alignment bolts in there, so that shouldn't be an issue. I'll do that, pull that clamp off and see what I have, if this is where I should be checking the end play on this thing. So I'll bring you back. I've got to show you guys something. When I took that TA out of the housing, I had talked about not being able to find these 1/4 inch bolts that were supposed to go in to lock the lower part of the TA and the upper part of the TA together, so when you removed it. You know, I looked for them. I couldn't find a place to put bolts. And it's clearly shown in here that you're supposed to use a cap screw. Now, when I came back and read this, it does not say 1/4 inch. And I don't know where I got that from, but somewhere I got 1/4 inch. Now, it's possible that maybe somebody left a comment on one of the videos and said 1/4 inch. But regardless of the point, I came up with that 1/4 inch. And here's kind of what I was looking at. The cap screw in the washer that's supposed to hold it together, and it's down here, and to me it looked like it was on the flange. Well, here is a case where, to begin with, if you pull this thing apart, you really don't need to hold those two pieces together. You can pull the upper part of that TA out and it'll just disengage itself from the lower part, and then you can pull the lower part out separately. But as you probably are seeing in the video that I posted, I had issues trying to put it back together again by putting the lower part in first and then putting the second or upper part in afterwards. I could not align the splines of those clutch plates up with the shaft. They just bound against them and you couldn't do it. So I had to pull it back out again, and then I came up with a way of putting some washers into the shaft and holding the two pieces together and then putting it back in. Well, lo and behold, originally what I thought was that there was some place in this thing where there was a flange and a 1/4-inch bolt cap screw went into it to hold the two of them together. And then I come over here to show you that it said 1/4-inch bolts and cap screws, and I couldn't find the area. And I look at it again, and apparently I never looked at this picture to begin with. But clearly, the cap screw in the washer number 1 is the exact same thing that I did to put the thing back together. So if I had read it or reread it, when I couldn't find a place to put the 1/4-inch cap screws, if I had come back over here and reread it and looked at it more thoroughly, I would have realized that they were talking about putting a screw into the end of the shaft and using washers against that splined gear there. But anyways, just goes to show you that I'm an idiot. And you need to really look at things. But I'll bring you back for the rest of the project. Okay, so just a brief overview. I'm going to start putting the shaft back in now. I've got to get this gear and that spacer back in. This is a gear and spacer. Well, this is a new gear that came with the TA assembly. The new TA assembly that's sitting on there. But that is a gear. If you saw the video of when I took the shaft out, the gear that kind of fell out the bottom. So this is a new gear, and it's going to go into there. So I've got to get the shaft through there, the gear on, the spacer on. A good view, not a good view. I'm going to be kind of working through the opening, so you're probably not going to be able to see much of it. What I did, I put some high-tran oil. What I'm doing here is trying to get, there's a gear that is behind a housing plate that you've got to get over the shaft and behind the housing plate and engaged. You'll see it in front, it's actually in front of that larger gear.
So it's kind of hard to get it over the shaft and engaged into the back part of the TA and behind that housing cover. So I had to struggle with it a little bit, but I finally got it.
Kind of like a balancing act here. Okay, well, I've got it that far. There's some place that I have to be today. So, I'm going to let me bring you back tomorrow. You know, one of the things I wanted to touch on is I don't want anybody that watches these videos to think, well, I couldn't do that because, you know, he's got this engine stand and it's up on this engine stand and he can turn it around and pivot it. You could do the same thing with, you know, in a barn and use an engine hoist and just hold it up on an engine hoist and be rebuilding this transmission. Yeah, it wouldn't be as easy as being able to swivel it, but it could be done, and it could be done. And one of the things is that if it's going to be end up to be a long-term project, you've got to need to kind of keep track of everything because tearing something apart and putting it back together kind of right away to rebuild it is one thing. It's kind of fresh in your memory about what happened and how it happened. But if it's going to turn out to be a long-term project, you got to kind of organize things to make sure that, you know, it can be, there's a resemblance of how it came apart and where it came apart, you know. So, you know, one of the things that I did was kind of organize the gears in the order that they came out of the transmission up on the bench. And if you need to, like here, I made a note that that's the back side of the gear cluster. So, trying to keep it organized, but don't look at, you know, what I've got or what I'm doing or the tools that I use and say, well, I don't have that and it can't be done, because it can be done. I mean, in worst case scenario, you could build a wooden frame to set this thing on and keep the bottom of it open so that you can access the gears from the bottom to put them back in or take them out. It can always be done. So I just kind of wanted to get that organization and you know, don't feel that you can't do it because you don't have certain things. It can be done. It can always be done. One of the things I kind of wanted to show you, these are those spacers that go in between the gears, and it's funny, actually all this spacer is a piece of it's not Schedule 40 pipe, but it's probably Schedule 30 pipe, 2.5 inch pipe. You can see the weld seam right there of the pipe. Now what they've done is buffed it off and probably machined that weld off, because that weld usually kind of sticks up, and you can kind of see, hopefully the light hits it right, you can kind of see where it kind of got machined down there. But all it is a piece of pipe. So what I do is I cleaned it up. I put it in the parts washer and just cleaned it up, and I'm gonna just lubricate it up with a little high-tran oil before I put it back into the thing. But I kind of thought that was ironic. I'll bring it back. And again, all I'm doing is putting these gears back in together in order as they came out. Now, some of the pieces and parts I'm cleaning up. Other pieces I'm just leaving, if the lubrication on them looks good to begin with. I just leave it that way. Parts that are dirty, bad, or got that slimy oil, or not slimy, but diluted oil, whatever that oil is, that grayish matter on it is, I clean them up. I'll tell you, getting that last gear and spacer in there was no easy feat. Well, it was easy to get it in there. Pulling the shaft through with it in there, because there's no way to grab a hold of the end of it. You kind of got to get your fingers in the end of the shaft and go to the other end and try and push at the same time. I'll bring you back. What I did is the end bearing, I put it in the parts washer because it was kind of soaked in that old oil, and I wanted to get as much of that old oil out of there as possible. So I put it in the parts washer, blew it out with air hose, and just going to soak it in high-tran oil, new oil.